Hello, this is the lecture that goes along with chapter 1. Now you want to make sure you're reading the chapter. If you have any questions, you can post those in D2L under chapter question. That way I can answer them for everybody. That also goes along with any questions you might have from this lecture itself. You want to follow up with some questions about something I said, feel free to do that there. I'm going to break this up into more than one lecture because otherwise it might be a little long to do at once. But this gives you a pretty good sense of how the rest of this summer session is going to run in terms of lectures. So here we are, Foundations of Communication, which is chapter 1. And what I'm going to discuss first would be the communication models. And really there's one model the book focuses on and it talks about another one. So let's go ahead and look at them. So we get these two views of communication, and the first view of communication is a linear view, right? Speaker, listener, speaker, listener. This goes back to Claude Shannon and Richard Weaver in the Bell Telephone Laboratories, 1930s and 40s. Anyway, but the idea is it's sort of like tag, like, right? Me speak, you. I'm using like children's broken language, right? Like me speak, you listen. Now me speak, now you speak, me listen, sort of like little kids do. There's just a sort of turn taking. I speak, you listen. I speak, you're right. And so that's a very linear view. This is also more than that. This linear view of communication is one that understands that the listener is very passive. So as the speaker, I'm very active, and I impart information, knowledge, messages, meanings, what have you, to you as the listener. And the listener is very passive. That's important to note here, right? The listener is passive. They're just sitting there receiving, like, it's all sort of being like poured into them. I know quite the graphic for you. So that's the linear view. And then we get this transactional view, which is the idea that at once we're always a speaker and listener. And it says speaker slash listener because part of it is that we're always, even as we're communicating, we're receiving other messages back from people. It's a very continuous, fluid process. So let's go over that a little more slowly and carefully, looking at all the parts that the book has laid out for us. As we look at the model, I'm going to sort of highlight or accentuate different parts of it as we go along and I speak with the different pieces. So you'll see sometimes these purple fields or yellow rings surround things that I'm talking about. So just keep an eye out for that as we're going over this. So the first piece of the model we're going to talk about, in some ways what's very basic, is the message. You see that's what I have a little red pointer here. That's the this outer ring is the message. And one thing I want to note is that a message is different from a meaning. Right? A message is different from a meaning. A message is the container, my way to try to convey a meaning. And when I send a message, when I say something to a person, or I gesture in a certain way, or I smile, I mean to convey something, right? I mean to convey something. There's a meaning in it. The meaning the other person takes that message might be the same. It might be different, right? So even if we think about nonverbal messages, it may be that you see somebody else in a store and you think you might know them. This is my problem. I'm bad at recognizing faces. And so you see them in a store and you think it might be a friend, and they look over at you and see a sort of like smile, like, like this big sort of grin, smile, hey, warm, inviting thing. And you mean like, hey, buddy, old pal. And they might think you are hitting on them. They might think that you think you know them, right? But they may take a different meaning than you may. They might think, do they think they know me? I don't think I know them. So they might get the same meaning that you had intended, but they may take a different meaning, like, are they flirting with me? What? You're like, what's that about? How dare they? Who is that ugly man think he is? I don't know, right? So that's a message, and so message and meaning are different, but this outer ring, that would be the messages. So the next piece of the model we're going to look at is this encoding and decoding. And notice this, there we have two source, source and receivers, two people sending and receiving messages at the same time. And they're involved in that encoding and decoding. And that's what I mean by meanings and messages are different, right? So there's that big smile. I've encoded something in it, meaning something, and they're decoding it. Hopefully the same way. You think about, like, I don't know if you're a kid, you ever had like a decoder ring, or if you're familiar with the movie A Christmas Story, right? And there's the Little Orphan Annie decoder ring, which, by the way, my mom actually had one. Whatever. Anyway, so, right, it's all about, we're trying to hopefully decoding the message the same way the other person meant, but we might take something different from it, right? So it may be that somebody asks you, hey, how are things going? And you say, oh, well, they could be worse. And by that you mean, things are pretty good. I mean, it could go downhill from here, but I don't know. It's all right. And they might think, oh my gosh, how bad is it? And you're just sort of joking around. You meant a certain, you're just like, it could be worse. Like, yeah, things are fine. Everything has its ups and downs, but you're okay with it. That's what you meant. That's what you were trying to encode. In decoding it, they heard it and went, oh no. And we're like, what's wrong? Is everything okay? And they might go into more of a panic mode. So that encoding and decoding, the idea that these messages are conveying or attempting to convey a meaning, and the meaning that we intend might be different from what other people are getting from it. So that's that encoding, trying to put a meaning into a message, and that decoding is trying to find a meaning in that message, which may or may not be the same. That's the challenge of communication. Then we move on to feed forward. You see it's up here and down here. The book talks about feed forward, and that's just the idea that sometimes our messages, that might be verbal, they might be nonverbal, are ways of letting people know that we're about to communicate with them. So sometimes, like, I'll be walking through my living room even, and my wife will stop and look up at me, make eye contact with me, which is like, hey, I'm going to tell you something, right? That's what she's doing. She's not just like looking lovingly into my eyes and remembering all the happy years we've had together. She's letting me know, like, oh, good, there you are. I want to ask you about dinner or something, right? And so that's part of that feed forward. Feed forward might also be, ooh, do you have a minute? Or you'll never guess. It might be a text message that says, got a minute? Right, that could be part of that feed forward. It's the message that comes before sort of the main event of the message. That's the feed forward. You see it there and up there. Feedback, which is something, I mean, the feed forward thing is fine, but feedback is really important in this model. And you see it's this dotted line that's running right underneath the message. So feedback can be verbal, it can be nonverbal. So, and this is part of what this model is, this transactional model, the idea that we are constantly sending and receiving messages. So as I'm speaking to you, you are giving me some sort of, at the very least, even if you say nothing, some sort of nonverbal feedback. Because you're looking at me stone-faced and bored, which tells me, or I might, no, it doesn't tell me, right? Encoding, decoding, I may take from that you're bored, you don't care, you're dismissive of it, right? You might smile and nod along, which gives me this, which I would take to mean like, okay, you're with me, you're tracking on this. Right? You might roll your eyes, right? And so that's right. So constantly, even as words are coming out of my mouth, you're also sending me messages, with that. Even if you think about texting, some of that feedback that comes with even just that you see that, oh, they're going to reply, or wait, they aren't replying, they've said nothing. There's a certain sort of type of feedback, kind of, sort of, right? But we think a lot about feedback being in present, in the moment, being able to hear or to see them, right? And that of course affects us as we're communicating. We're talking about effects a little bit, but it's this constant process. So we're always sending and receiving, encoding and decoding these messages, because it might be, you might have had this experience that maybe at work you're talking to a colleague, right, at work, and you're explaining an issue as you're talking about this thing that's happened, but what was really a challenge for you. They roll their eyes, and that's right, that's some feedback, that's a message to you as you're talking, but then you're not sure, wait, are you rolling your eyes? And you might be thinking in your head, are they rolling their eyes at me for complaining about this? Are they rolling their eyes at, oh my gosh, another one of those customers, right? What are they rolling their eyes at, right? So we're trying to encode and decode this message, and it might be we read it wrong, right? Hard to say, right? But that's that feedback that's going on just like all the time. by the way, it's not showing in this model here, but if you were to say, wait, you're rolling your eyes, you're rolling at me or you're rolling it at the customer, that would be a meta communication or a meta message, right? If you say, real quick, are you rolling your eyes at me or at the person talking about, that's a message, that's about a message, that's why it's meta. That's not on this model as you're seeing it, but the book talks about it, and that would be the idea of it being meta. Okay, so we talked about feedback. Now the next piece of the model I want to look at are channels, right? Excuse me. Channels are the way that the messages travel. Those channels, as the book talks about, those can be verbal, they can be nonverbal. Sometimes we think about technology as well as being a certain sort of channel. The book talks a bit about olfaction, right? The idea that you might wear a certain scent as part of a way of letting somebody know that you're trying to impress them romantically, right? I could tell stories, but I'll stop there, right? So yes, there are certain, so those are channels, right? There are the ways that we are sending those messages. Again, those messages might be sent electronically, they might be sent in person, they might be sent verbally, they might be sent non-verbally. They can be a whole combination of those things. But those are the channels, the means by which we send that message, and within which we've encoded and decoded a meaning, through which we're getting our feedback. Right? It's a great big, it's this sort of this big thing. We're trying to dissect all these pieces, but they're all connected into each other. Okay, so that's channels. Moving on next, we get this big circle in the middle here, noise. And the idea is that as we're communicating, we're always being challenged by noise. The book lays out different types of noise, so I won't belabor it a whole lot here. But noise can be physical, right? It can be that the TV is on too loud, that, I was having a conversation with my sister was visiting the other day, and because she's visiting, she wanted to make sure we kept a social distance. And so, but the air conditioner unit kept turning on, so there's that sort of physical noise. But we get other noise that is psychological in nature. So maybe you're at work and a customer comes to talk to you and you have a hard time concentrating on their message and then sort of encoding and decoding because you just got some news. It could be good, it could be bad in your personal life, and naturally distracting you, right? So that would be a type of psychological noise. So there's different types of noise, and the book lays that out pretty clearly, I think. But yeah, so in the center there we have noise, and it points in all directions because all of this stuff is being affected by noise. Right. Then we get effects. That's right here, these two yellow boxes, effects at the center of each of these source, receiver, encoding, decoding are these effects. And that's the idea that part of this model talking about being transaction is that we come out of every single interaction a little different. It may not be that our life has changed, but our relationship has changed. And it may not be in any profound way at all. If anything, it may just go to cement what we've already known. So I want to make it sound like every exchange is, life-changing necessarily. But there are effects, right? You have a conversation with a customer, and it's frustrating, and it affects you, right? You come away from that exchange, that you've been affected that way. You go to your supervisor and you're asking if you can leave early because of a personal or a family issue. They say no. That's going to affect you and also how you enter that relationship, or how that you go on through your relationship with them and communicating with them later, because you're expecting them to say no again later. This might confirm your suspicion that they don't care about you, or maybe it's new information, you thought they did care about you and now you feel like maybe they don't because of this. But the point is, we are affected by each of these instances. We leave it as a different person. There are these outcomes of it, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about the communication isn't actually repeatable. We'll talk about some of that stuff in a little bit. But yeah, effects. There are these as part of the communication process. We are affected by it. And like I say, it might be a interaction you have with somebody that seems rather unremarkable, and it might be that part of that effective is it just cements for you that things are just exactly as you expect they are, right? That they're helpful or not helpful, whatever. It just confirms to you one more time they're exactly who you thought they were, right? So that would be the part of the effects that comes from communication. Then up here we get the whole thing. Up here in this upper right corner is the context, right? And the context. And context is huge. So huge, in fact, I'm going to turn to another slide so we can just talk about context. So it is true in communication that context really is key. In terms of how we encode messages and how we decode messages, context is huge. So there are 4 aspects of this I want to look at. The book talks about these, but I want to take a few moments to elaborate on them. In part, I don't think the book is very clear, and also because I want to emphasize to you how important I think these concepts are. So there is the physical context. So if you are in a restaurant, if you remember those happy bygone halcyon days of 5 months ago when we used to actually go into restaurants before we were part of a global pandemic, right? When you have a conversation with somebody in a restaurant, that may cause you to speak, in code, right, a message differently. You may not use the same sort of coarse language because there are people around. You may not be as blunt or as graphic talking about whatever personal thing it might be, your body, your relationship, whatever, right? Um, that would be, if there's other people around, like in that context, the physical context, right? If there's customers nearby, you're going to talk to a colleague perhaps differently about a problem than if the customer or if you're in the back room talking to your colleague about issues with the customer, right? So you're going to talk differently in those ways. And so, yeah, even in the workplace, if you're talking to a colleague about an issue with a customer, and you might say, well, so this customer has some concerns, which is the sort of message that the way you're saying it in front of them, that physical context, is different from in the back room. They're a way saying the customer is a complainer and we got to get rid of them, right? You're going to say different things. But like I say, in a restaurant, you might not be as loud, as gross, whatever. So that physical context is going to change things. You're also going to decode things differently. Knowing that customers there, you might be trying to read between the lines what the person is saying. Also, I think about when my sister was visiting here recently and we were outside and she wanted to socially distance, and so the air conditioner unit was on. And so we were talking a lot like this, sort of loud and over enunciating. Physically, when there's all that noise going on, it made sense to do that. If she and I were doing that with each other, or one of us was just doing it, and there wasn't that loud noise, talking like this would make it sound like I'm talking to you like I believe you are a small, ignorant child, right? You know what I mean? I would take it very differently, but there's a loud noise. I know exactly how you're talking to me that way, right? So there's that physical context that changes how we encode and decode those messages. Cultural. If you're talking to somebody and think about sort of their cultural background and your own cultural background, if you're talking to them, as they speak to you, they look down. If you don't see it as being an issue of, or as being because you two are from different cultures, you might think that they are, let's say if you're sort of part of a dominant US culture, you might think they're being dishonest with you. That's a sign of being untruthful, is looking down, or just that they can't be bothered to look at you, as opposed to the fact that there are cultural contexts or certain cultures in which that direct eye contact doesn't express trust the way it expresses dominance and assertiveness, really not more than assertiveness, aggressiveness. So cultural context, that making eye contact or not, might mean different things within different sorts of cultural context. If we think about how cultural contexts vary by, even by age and different places of culture, right? That saying certain things, how it's said or what is said in one place may carry different meaning than in another because of the culture of that context. Right. We also have the social, psychological, those contexts. If you think about, and we're going to talk about this more a little bit about relationships, which is what this has to do with, but that relationship and dynamic between you and the other person you're speaking with, that greatly affects how you say things and how things are taken, right? So if you are a supervisor and somebody at work says to you, okay, well, I'm taking off a few minutes early, I'll see you later. You might think, wait a minute, you're talking to me that way makes it sound like you have no respect for my authority here as like the supervisor, you're just leaving whenever you want. Whereas might be much more appropriate if you were just a call and you're saying, okay, I'm going to take off early, I'll see you later, right? Because you may speak differently, like to a supervisor saying, I'm going to take off a few minutes early if that's okay, right? You're going to get a different sort of message said a different way because of the context of that. Right? If you say it to a colleague, you say, I'm going to take off a few minutes early if that's okay. they might be like, yeah, whatever, like, why are you saying that to me? Or they may understand that you're looking for permission from them, in the sense of maybe there's, if you're sort of new and you're saying that, it might be like, oh yeah, it's cool, nobody cares. Or to be like, I wouldn't do that, right? But that context, that relationship, that social psychological relation, context there is about that relationship between you, and that helps us understand how we should take that message and helps us think about how it is we want to express that message. Right? And then temporal, and temporal is about relationships of time, right? Something that is temporal. And so the book says, that certain messages should be said differently following others. So if somebody's you walk into somebody's office and they look like they're really just like something's going on, you say, "You okay?" And they get, "Yeah, I just found out that my grandparent died." You might not be like, "Oh, okay. Well, anyway, hey, so that report that we have coming out tomorrow." Like, you may not say that. Maybe you might approach it that way. You might say, "Oh gosh, I wanted to ask you something, but if you're not good with this right now, we can talk about it later." You're going to approach it differently. But also think about the context of your relationship. Let's say that you and a coworker, you get along with each other pretty well, and you have an argument. It's not the worst thing, but it's not the nicest thing you've had. You had this argument with them on Tuesday, right? On Tuesday, you have an argument with them. So you go to talk with them on Wednesday. They may be offended if you act like nothing's happened. Like, we didn't just have that blowout. You're just like, oh, hey, by the way, have you seen if we've gotten this, had those things come back in stock? You might feel sort of offended, like, wait, don't just act like nothing has happened, right? So you may approach it differently and say, hey, how you doing? I didn't want to bother you. Just want to know if you knew if they had restocked or not, right? You're saying this way that conveys to them, or maybe you're trying to convey to them, like, listen, I'm sort of walking eggshells here because I'm not sure how we're doing, right? So it's that sequence of things, that context of time may affect how it is that we understand people, how we think about them. And when it comes back to that communication is repeatable, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, right? So that's where we are here. That's the communication model. Next, we're going to talk about our principles of communication, and I'm going to have that start the next piece of this lecture.